Greetings sailors and welcome back to World of Warships and a Patreon supporter replay. This is Andy CX, who actually featured in a relatively recent game of mine. I think they were in, what was it, the Des Moines, the Salem. And this time round, I promise I'm going to mostly say nicer things about them. Mostly. I'm such a kind and generous Patreon creator in that I occasionally deign to say nice things about the people that support me monetarily. God, I'm so good at this. I'm so good at being a YouTube type person. It's almost a wonder how I got here. Anyway, so Andy is, as you can see, playing the Kansas. I can only assume he lost some kind of bet because, it's not very good, it's not very fun. It's a fairly strong contender for the title of worst tier 8 battleship, which I think for a long time would have fairly easily been the Monarch taking that crown. But the Kansas has then come along, and despite it having more guns, they feel just about as bad to use as a Monarch, and Vanguard as well. It's got those same 15-inch guns. And it's, of course, in addition, a hell of a lot slower as well. So, it's a big slow tub with not particularly good guns. I think it's actually got worse ammo performance than the Colorado, if I'm remembering correctly. However, at least this is a tier 8 game, so that doesn't matter quite so much. But Andy is going to have to find his ranging a bit better than he has done so far. These are still slow US battleship shells, but they don't, of course, retain the energy or the penetration as nearly as well as the 16-inch guns on the North Carolina does. So even though it's got more guns than North Carolina, it's just that bit less effective. I apologise for any clattering going on in the background because there is a cat at the moment who's decided just now is an excellent time to be a butthead and just disrupt the recording generally as much as he can. But we shall try and continue on anyway, because if I didn't, then if I was waiting for a moment when a cat wasn't going to interrupt me, I'd be waiting for a very long time probably. This isn't a particularly auspicious start so far. I mean, he came in fairly late and he's not managed to do a great deal so far, but there are still plenty of things to shoot at on this flank. There's 3 of the enemy's battleships, all 3 of their tier 7s, or actually were there more than, I don't know. There's 3 of their tier 7 battleships. I've forgotten what the enemy team composition was already, and in return they've got their 2 tier 8 battleships here. So in theory this isn't too badly matched. They've also got destroyer screening for them and an Erland that is actually working on flanking that group of ships down there as well. They've also got the B-cap, but the ship that's done that is pushing through, and it looks like they're going to run smack into the large group of enemy ships over by the C-cap. And their own group of ships, I think they're occupied with a destroyer over there. It's not entirely clear, but they're all clustered up on the edge of the map, and they don't look like they're going to be doing anything particularly effective there. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. So we know exactly where that enemy Kagero is. They are in that cloud of smoke at the moment. I think the Lo Yang must have their hydro on cooldown right now, so otherwise they'd be trying to engage that smoke maybe a little more aggressively. I mean, they are putting torpedoes out all the same. Andy as well is keeping his nose very firmly towards them and holding fire. Well, I say holding fire just for the time being. He is firing, but is getting himself undetected for as long as he can, and I think then he actually, there we go, he's now surface detected. So I think he was deliberately holding fire there. This thing at least has a relatively decent surface spotting range, but it's also got a really long reload, and unlike the tier 9 and tier 10, you can't try and modify that with equipment. You don't have that last equipment slot to speed up your reload a bit at the expense of turret traverse, which is not particularly fantastic on these ships either. So Kansas really does get the absolute worst set of characteristics of all these new ships. The lackluster guns, it's very slow, and it does not have the option of doing anything to offset that horrendous reload, apart from taking a bunch of damage and having adrenaline rush, of course. He's now at a range, though, where his guns ought to be much more effective, sub 10 kilometers, and it's not like these ships are angling particularly well, although I think he was aiming a little too far forward there, but it's still an okay hit. 6k damage is not completely terrible, but a bit more amidships, and it could have been a bit more. However, two of these ships are Scharnhorsts. The Scharnhorsts, of course, have torpedoes, and while eating a bunch of Scharnhorst torpedoes at point-blank range might not kill him, it would certainly do an awful lot of damage. Because this at least does have, and it's one of the other few saving graces of these ships, they do have decent torpedo protection, especially compared to North Carolina, which actually has pretty poor torp protection. So Andy makes a very risky turn away here, and in doing so exposes himself to fire from all three of these ships. Although the Colorado was by far the nastiest one, but although he's taken a bunch of damage, he has gotten away with it, and unfortunately isn't really able to quite similarly punish that Colorado in return, just because, again, these guns are not very good. Even a Colorado at 10 kilometers range, barely angled, and this time it was really aimed much more amidships, he just couldn't particularly find traction. They are now rather lower health, and if he gets luckier, there we go, he actually manages to land a Citadel there. So that's a kill, and probably the nastiest set of guns he has to face on this flank, because the two Scharnhorsts really don't have anything like the caliber to overmatch or even slightly scratch his angled armor. It's really only superstructure penetrations that can do anything against him right now. If they were firing HE, they might have a slightly better chance, but as it is, they're sticking with the AP shells. So hammering away at the Gunnizer now, and that was not quite enough to finish him off. So that one turret that was knocked out that's now out of sequence, that should do the trick. That Erland that went round behind them doesn't really seem to have had that big of an impact so far. It's not quite clear what they were thinking going all the way that far back. I mean, yes, there's an enemy carrier in play, but their planes have been really focusing on the 8, 9, 10 line, where the enemy team has just been absolutely able to annihilate what was there of Andy's team, although they have taken a fair number of losses themselves in the process. So Andy surviving through this might actually prove to be rather crucial, although this Imagi does still have a fair chunk of health themselves, enough that maybe they could have been more aggressive here when Andy was pushing in to try and close the distance and well, keep them out the cap, but also, I'm guessing, get his guns to behave a bit more effectively. He has, however, not taken enough heavy damage to seriously impede his healing ability, and of course another thing these ships do not get is the extra healing ability that other US battleships do, because why not? Just kick them when they're down already wargaming. And between them, this Scharnhorst is not too much longer for this world. They do have a Bismarck coming up here as well. I thought maybe the Erland would have tried to do more against them. They can certainly afford to get in a lot closer, but yeah, I don't know if they really have been particularly effective down there. I think they landed some hits on the Bismarck. The Bismarck's coming in with not that much health, but yeah, that Erland's been a bit too cautious considering how things have played out. So after this absolutely bruising encounter over on the ACAT, there's only a couple of ships left on each team, and Andy is now really not particularly high health at all. But they do have the majority, I think, of the firepower left. I mean, the enemy team's got 2 cruisers and that not particularly healthy Bismarck, as well as their own carrier. And while Andy's team doesn't have a carrier left, the tier 6 carriers were probably never going to be that big of a thing in this game. Although, having said that, you know, if the enemy Furious comes after Andy with torpedo bombers or manages to set lots of fires, that could be a real problem, because I'm sure that Andy has lost a pretty decent chunk of his AA at this point. It's just a battleship problem generally, but for these ships, particularly when they're so slow, and it's true of the American standards generally, is that by the time you get to the end of a game, your AA is always going to be so much more, or so much less effective, just from the amount of HE spam you will have usually taken. And so, although these do get a defensive AA, it's really a bit of a gimmick as far as these things go. It absolutely isn't a particularly useful consumable. I mean, it just generally isn't for the most part on most ships these days anyway, but on a battleship when you're going to take such a heavy battering, yeah, it just really doesn't retain its usefulness throughout a match. If somebody's striking you early on, for example, and you're in the middle of a group of ships, then sure, yeah, having a defensive available is not nothing, but it's never going to save your ass. There are very few ships where the defensive makes enough of a difference. So now he's got a fire drop, he's got his defensive going again, and we know the Leander is somewhere close, and it turns out the enemy Furious is as well. Now they do get 2 torpedoes away, but fortunately his torpedo belt mitigates most of the damage there, and he's actually able to knock out that Furious for another kill. That's his 3rd, and so we don't have to worry about any more air attacks. The Liao Yang is playing it understandably very cautious though. They don't have a lot of health left, and the Leander could easily shred them if they catch that destroyer broadside with the improved British AP. In fact, really it's supposed to be SAP, but now we have proper, air quotes, SAP in the game. They've chosen to leave the British light cruiser AP as being AP as far as the symbols are concerned. And I think mechanically they're actually a bit different, because that's AP but with kind of better penetration characteristics, whereas SAP is more like a mix between AP and HE, mechanically speaking, at least if I'm remembering correctly. So even though in real life, you know, both SAP, they behave differently in game. So his first shot against Leander, not particularly great, but we'll see if the next one will do any better. Leander trying to come around to get torpedoes away, but Andy knows exactly what he's doing, and before he actually can get a good enough angle, Andy is then able to finish him off. And the angling of the Leander actually would have helped Andy there in terms of his shells then being able to arm. So that just leaves the Straws and potentially a shot at a Kraken. He also might get an extra bit of damage out of this, but you just really never know with these guns. They did lose the Amagi at some point, but they'd also taken out that enemy Bismarck. So yeah, this was kind of close as it came down to it in terms of ships, but in terms of points, they stayed ahead for most of the game. So getting that final lovely kill was just kind of like the icing on the cake of what was a fairly tense game. Even if the enemy team wasn't that great in terms of map control, they still did their best in terms of actually trying to kill this team. And somehow, surprisingly, it was that enemy Leander that topped out the enemy team list, followed by the Straws. So maybe it was the enemy battleships not quite pulling their weight in that one, and everyone else struggling to take up the slack. So that was a pretty good outing for this ship. I mean, just managing to make it over 100k with these guns I think is a feat in of itself, and managing a Kraken on top of that, yeah, that was definitely a good Kansas game as these things go. And despite my joke at the start, I mean, yeah, if you can skip past the Kansas, then you might well want to, but if you've got sufficient camos and flags to speed up the grind and a premium account, then I don't know, maybe it's worth playing it through just to see it for yourself and experience it for yourself, and maybe it will click for somebody somewhere. But it has the reputation it does for a reason, and I can only hope that it gets further buffs at some point, because lest we forget, you know, this took like a patch since it was released to already get what was it, increased Sigma, and I think tier 9 and tier 10 got buffed as well. So I don't think those will be the last buffs that we see, and it certainly won't be the last chance that us CCs get to point at Wargaming and go, told you so. At least as far as these ships go. So that's it for this replay. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath the video, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.